Good morning, it's Mr. Mike coming to you from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Another dreary day outside, we're going to make the best of it. This is episode number 15, Dino-A-Day, brought to you by the Mechanicsburg Learning Center. Today's animal was one of my favorites, Diplodocus. Diplodocus, what the kids call long neck, what the adults call sauropod. Diplodocus, the name means double-beamed lizard, and the reason they called it double-beamed lizard, we'll take a look at the model here, because under its tail, it had two lengths of chevron-shaped bones, not a single set. So it had two, which is why they called it double-beamed. Great animal. For a while, it was the longest dinosaur ever discovered, but of course, discoveries have been made, and they keep trying to outdistance the previous discovery. So this was discovered in Colorado in 1877, named a year later by famous paleontologist O.C. Marsh. And that's where, when he took a look at those bones of the tail, that's when he decided to call it double-beamed lizard or Diplodocus. I grew up calling it Diplodocus. It's okay, but we've done some studies and figured out that most people call it Diplodocus. So this lived between 154, 152 million years ago. Its length has been estimated anywhere from 75 to 80 to 90 feet, the whole way up to some crazy numbers like 175 feet. So we think it's probably in the realm of somewhere around 108 to maybe 110. And then a very, very recent study came out and said, well, why don't we stick at 105? 105 feet is extremely long. And one of the things that made this animal so long was its tail. Its tail was extremely long. In fact, one of the theories is, as it would walk by on all fours, now it was able to rear up, we think, and I'll tell you more about that soon. As it walked by on all fours, now some carnivores would try to get it. Much smaller animals, but they would probably hunt in packs and try to go after this guy. And what Diplodocus, we think, did was take its tail and whip it to try to dissuade these predators from getting too close. And when he whipped it, the end of the tail was like Indiana Jones, and it actually broke the sound barrier and possibly caused a bang or a boom or something, just like when you whip a whip. Okay, so we think that's what happened. It's possible. There were some theories about it. Some recently are saying, we're not sure, but we do think it's an interesting theory that may have happened. I want to point out something on its front feet, otherwise known as the manus. If you look really closely, you see right here, I'll point to it with my yellow pencil. You see right here? That, folks, is a claw. All right, it had a single claw on its front foot. We don't really know why, but it was there nonetheless. And if you look at its back feet, not the prettiest things in the world, but those things had some claws on them too. So, yeah, Diplodocus had a lot of interesting features. Speaking of interesting features, let's take a look at its skull. It's rare to find a skull of these because if you look at the animal, look how small its head is compared to the rest. The head is very small and fragile and often does not get preserved. But here's what we do know about the Diplodocus skull. Shaped like that, and if you look, it did have some interesting teeth. Okay, you can just barely see those in there. As I've described them before, they're sort of peg-like, maybe like pencils, okay? Specifically designed for stripping the leaves off of trees and preserving, actually preserving the tree, keeping it alive. So it wasn't killing the trees, it was pruning the trees. So that's what its skull looked like. It had a battery of teeth. In other words, it had several teeth backups because the teeth we think maybe lasted a month or so till they got worn down and needed to be replaced. So there was other teeth existing below it. In fact, 5 rows or so, that when the first one popped out, another one would grow in. So had a battery of teeth. In 1990, they actually found skin impressions of this animal. Very exciting because that's kind of rare. So when you look at the impressions that the skin made in the rock, in the mud at the time, and then preserved as rock, they discovered that this thing probably had some very sharp, narrow pointed spines, at least on the tail, coming up like this, okay? Several of them going down the tail. Perhaps they went the whole way up its back, and we've seen later models that show Diplodocus with little tiny spines that stick straight up out of its back in later models. So, if you would like to see Diplodocus bones, well, you have a good shot at it, because really, Diplodocus is one of the most popularly displayed dinosaurs ever. And the reason being, when it was discovered, it ended up going to the Carnegie Museum. And the Carnegie Museum, Andrew Carnegie, was so excited about his find that he set about making casts of the bones and sent them basically all over the world. So you can see Diplodocus in hundreds of museums all over the world. One of the closest would be Smithsonian and the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. Originally, O.C. Marsh, the man that discovered it, didn't discover it, the man that named it, thought that this was an aquatic animal, thought that it went swimming because of where its nostrils are on the top of its head. You might be able to see a little bit better here on the skull. Okay, they were way up here, okay, not necessarily down in front where you would expect to see them. They were further up. So they said, oh, well, then in case, see, look right there in the front, okay. So if that's the case, and this thing probably went swimming and kind of, dipped its head above, kept its head above the water while the rest of the animal was swimming. That would be pretty much impossible for that to happen, because the animal was so big, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 feet long, that it would have been so deep in the water that it would have made it difficult to breathe. The water pressure at that depth would have made its lungs very difficult to expand and contract. So it was definitely not submerged. It maybe hung out near water and maybe took a dip once in a while, splashed itself and cleaned itself off and took a little bath, but definitely didn't go deep into the water. So the other thing we want to talk about briefly before we get to today's story is the fact that it could get up on its hind legs. Now, typically, an animal that can do that has its center of gravity or center of mass further back, and this is exactly what happened with Diplodocus. If you have an animal where the bulk of its weight is right here or here, it would be more difficult for it to get up like this, but the center of its weight was back here, which made it a lot easier to get up. So it probably did get up on its hind legs to nibble at that very special vegetation that it could get to that other animals couldn't reach. Okay, so let's jump into the story today. The Diplodocus. Make sure you pronounce it Diplodocus and not Diplodocus. My giant friend Diplodocus. He'd never fit his body through that swing-out door like me and you, and so he'd never ride our bus. My giant friend Diplodocus. He'd walk to school instead to learn the subjects that are our concern. Of course, he might chew chalk to dust. My hungry friend Diplodocus. Geology and history. Sometimes they can be tough for me. He'd probably earn an A++. My learned friend Diplodocus. He'd graduate in 5 months flat, and he wouldn't boast, I'll tell you that. He'd leave top students in the dust. My humble friend Diplodocus. And then next year he would return, and it would be our turn to learn from he who traveled our earth's crust, my worldly friend Diplodocus. Do you suppose that he could teach from books that may be hard to reach? In truth, it's never been discussed. My long-necked friend Diplodocus. And at day's end, I'd ride him home. We'd startle people as we'd roam. But have no fear, it's only just my closest friend Diplodocus. The Diplodocus poem by Mr. Mike, illustrated by my son Ethan. Everybody say hello to Ethan. There's Ethan. From Dinorific Poetry, Volume 1. The only way you can see this correctly is if you look at this video in a mirror. Thanks so much for subscribing. All of the videos are now available on my YouTube page, which is Mr. Mike Sgrignoli. Just find that, subscribe, and we'll upload a brand new one every single day. Thanks so much to the Mechanicsburg Learning Center for making this possible. Thanks for tuning in to Mr. Mike's Dino-A-Day. We'll see you again tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a very special edition. Tomorrow we will be playing my Dinorific Scientific Name game, so grab a piece of paper and something to write with. We're going to quiz you about dinosaur names, so make sure you tune in for that. It's going to be a blast, and there might even be prizes to win. Have a great one.